Right friends, welcome back to News Analysis and Features. This is 50th week from 7th to 13th December. During 49th week, we discussed about the significance of controlling carbon dioxide emissions so as to control rise in temperature and the significance of controlling rise in temperature in comparison to pre-industrial levels, and further we will deliberate here about the outcome of historic deal at Paris. Before going into that, let us look at the top 5 carbon emitters. If you look at the top 5 carbon emitters, China stands at the top position, and all of you are well aware about the pollution levels in Beijing and other cities in China in recent days, and China is the topmost emitter with around 25% of the total carbon emissions in the world. So, China is at the top position with 25% in the world, followed by United States of America with 14%. European Union put together, that is the conglomerate of all 28 countries put together, is contributing to 10%. India is contributing to 7% of the carbon dioxide emissions. If you treat them as individual countries, that means if you treat European Union as individual countries, then India stands at 3rd position in carbon emissions, and China and United States of America are accounting for almost 40% of the global carbon dioxide emissions. Please look into this slide. These are tons of emissions per capita for each and every population. What is per capita emission? If you look at this, United States of America is leading the table with around 20 tons per capita. United States of America is leading with 20 tons per capita, whereas Russia is second place with 16 tons per capita, and India is way below at around 2.44 tons per capita. So, our per capita emissions are nowhere near the emissions of United States of America or other industrialized countries. We are way below in comparison to per capita emissions, and some news reports say that India is emitting around 1.5 to 2 tons per capita. Please don't go by these figures, because report to report these figures vary, but try to understand the situation. Out of the total emissions, China and America contribute to total 40% of carbon dioxide emissions, whereas if you look at per capita emissions, United States of America is leading with around 20 tons per capita, whereas India is way behind with around 2.44 tons per capita, right? So, under these circumstances, before Paris summit, almost 186 countries submitted their voluntary contributions, or you can say their intentions to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Their intentions to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by the year 2030 are popularly known as Intended Nationally Determined Contributions, or INDCs. So, these are the voluntary commitments given by various countries. That means it is a bottom-up approach. That means asking each and every country, what can you contribute to reduce global carbon dioxide emissions, in turn to reduce the rise in temperature. So, these 186 countries submitted their voluntary contributions to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and these were submitted prior to this Paris conference. And if you look at India's contributions, or you can say India's INDCs, India emphasized on 4 points. One is India will reduce carbon emissions per unit of GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 in comparison to 2005 levels. That is the first and the foremost intended contribution from India. That means it is the voluntary contribution from India. India wants to reduce by 33 to 35% per unit of GDP by 2030 in comparison to 2005 levels. The second important point is India committed voluntarily that by 2030, our power generation will constitute 40% of renewable energy, like solar, like wind energy. India's energy mix will have 40% of renewable energy by 2030. Third thing is, India will create carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030. What is carbon sink? Carbon sink is nothing but raising green cover, raising forest cover. By raising green cover, what will happen? Carbon dioxide will be absorbed naturally by forests. So, India committed it will create carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent by 2030. And the last but not the least, most important point is it requires finance. $2.5 trillion of finance will be needed to achieve these goals by 2030. So, these are the points of intended nationally determined contributions put forth by India to UNFCCC. And 8 key areas announced by India are reducing emissions intensity per unit of GDP, increasing the share of non-fossil fuels in its electricity mix. Third point is creation of carbon sink. Fourth one is adaptation and mobilization of finance. Then sustainable lifestyles, cleaner economic development, technology transfer, capacity building. So, India emphasized on all these points while submitting their intended nationally determined contributions. So, from this what India wants to convey is, though we are not part of the problem because 40% of the carbon dioxide emissions are contributed by United States of America and China. Though we are not part of the problem, but we want to contribute from our side. That is the message what India wants to convey. Not only that, India try to achieve 40% of renewable energy mix. That is another important aspect, right? So, India submitted their INDCs, and if you look at the INDCs submitted by other nations, United States of America stated they will reduce 26% to 28% of 2005 levels of carbon emissions by 2025. And China stated 60 to 65% of 2005 level by 2030 per unit of GDP. But please remember, China is already emitting around 25% of carbon dioxide in the world. So, they have to do a lot. So, these are the contributions of other countries. Please go through it. European Union committed 40% of reduction of 1990 level by 2030. Japan committed 26% of 2013 level by 2030. Like that, various countries committed. And before going into the outcome of this historic Paris deal, there are 3 aspects I would like to explain. One is the mitigation. What is the mitigation? Mitigation is basically reducing the greenhouse gas emissions so as to limit the future temperature rise. Mitigation is reducing greenhouse gas emissions so as to limit the future temperature rise. So, finance is required for that because countries have to switch over from fossil fuels to renewable energy like solar energy or wind energy. For that they require finance. That is known as the mitigation finance. Second one is adaptation. Whatever you do, already climatic changes have taken place and countries have to build a defense against these climatic changes. That is adaptation. Finance is required for that. Third one is this least developed countries and some countries which are situated almost at the sea level like Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Kiribati. These countries are at the door of risk because they may face risk and they may face damages, and ultimately to take care of these damages, finance is required, that is loss and damage. So, in a nutshell, I would like to tell you, mitigation is basically the steps required to be taken to control the temperature rise, to control the greenhouse gas emissions. Second one is adaptation. Already some changes took place, and to take care of the climatic changes, every country has to build their own defense. That is adaptation. Third one is loss and damage. That means because of the climatic changes, if some incidents occurs, then rehabilitation of the people may be required in low-lying countries. and for that loss and damage finance is also required. So what I mean to convey is finance is required for developing countries for all these three aspects. One is for mitigation, second one is adaptation, third one is for loss and damages. And finally, what came out of this historic deal? First and the foremost is, it is for the first time in history, a single agreement, or you can say a single joint statement was reached on climate change with the consensus of total 196 countries. Second important aspect is, countries came to the conclusion that average global temperatures should be limited to well below 2 degrees centigrade, and every endeavor should be made to limit them to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Third important aspect is, at some time between 2050 to 2100, somewhere between 2050 and 2100, a stage is to be reached where the amount of greenhouse gases emitted by human activity must be equal to the same levels which the trees and oceans can absorb. That means the earth should reach such a stage when the global greenhouse gas emissions are to be naturally absorbed by tree cover and oceans. This stage should be reached somewhere between 2050 to 2100, and each country's contributions of greenhouse gas emissions are to be renewed once in 5 years. Then another important point is, rich countries to maintain $100 billion a year funding pledge beyond 2020. Rich countries have to arrange $100 billion of funding beyond 2020, and that should become the floor level for further support by 2025. That means they have to increase the funding from 2025 further. So these are the important points of this historic deal, and if you want critically to examine this, there are some positives, and at the same time there are certain things without clear answers. Let us look at the positives. First and the foremost is, though they are not legally binding, but as the INDCs are given by the countries voluntarily, it puts moral pressure on the countries to implement them. Second is, it is for the first time world came to the consensus on the issue, and itself is a moral victory. Third point is, these are the intentions declared voluntarily by the countries, not by force, and they can be easily implemented. Fourth and important point is, a message has gone to the world that the era of fossil fuels is coming to an end. Fifth important point is, it reiterated about the climate finance of $100 billion of funding from 2020 with an intention to scale up by 2025. Then most important point is, it created awareness across the world with regard to the ill effects of global warming. So these are the positives. And if you look at the unanswered questions, there are several unanswered questions in this, and please give thought for these questions. First and the foremost is, if these INDCs are implemented in true letter and spirit, if at all these INDCs are implemented in true letter and spirit by all the countries, it will raise the global temperature up to 3.7 degrees centigrade, but not 2 degrees centigrade. Then what is the point in discussing 2 degrees centigrade and 1.5 degrees centigrade? As per the INDCs, temperature rise will go up to 3.7 degrees centigrade. And we are discussing about 2 degrees centigrade and 1.5 degrees centigrade. What is the point in debating on that, as the INDCs themselves point to 3.7 degrees centigrade rise? Second important point is, these are not legally binding. It shows that these are only intended contributions, or you can say they are looking like a joint statement of intent. Third important point is, if some country violates these INDCs, no penal provisions, no penalty, then how to monitor? How can you expect all the countries to ensure them morally? The fourth important point is, agreement says that developed countries should take the lead in mobilizing climate finance. Who will contribute to what extent? That is not clear. And China, already contributing to 25% of global greenhouse gas emissions, is categorized under developing country. How far it is justified? And some developed countries which are already into problems like Greece, Italy, Spain, can they contribute to climate finance? That is the million-dollar question. Without the specifics, people are talking about this climate finance by developed countries. Fifth important point is, the dividing line between developing countries and developed countries may be advantageous to certain countries like China. China already exhausting 25% of the emissions and it is categorized as developing country, and it is advantageous to the countries like China. Next important point is, what about the transfer of technology? Without the transfer of technology, how the developing countries will develop solar energy, wind energy? Whether the developed countries will give in writing, they will transfer technology? And what about intellectual property rights? If somebody invented something without charging anything, can the transfer of technology take place to developing countries? This is the million-dollar question. Next important point is $100 billion per annum is sufficient? No direct correlation between the finance required for adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, and at the same time INDCs. Various countries committed INDCs, and there is no direct correlation between the finance required and the INDCs, as India itself stated that the total requirement of finance is $2.5 trillion. Then the last important point is, no equitable sharing of the limited carbon space available further. Already we have consumed available carbon space to the extent of 2/3. Only 1/3 is left over, so as to limit global temperature to 2 degrees centigrade, if at all it is feasible and possible. And under these circumstances, no equitable sharing of the balanced limited carbon space available. So these are the unanswered questions, and there are no specific and clear answers for these questions. Let us hope some better sense to prevail, and from next conference of the parties onwards, people should take note of these unanswered questions so as to arrive at a comprehensive solution to limit global temperature to 2 degrees centigrade, if not 1.5 degrees centigrade. Hey friends, let us conclude at this juncture, and I hope you enjoyed both the 49th week news analysis and 50th week news analysis. And let me tell you once again, please listen to the first part of news analysis before listening to the second part, and let us conclude here. Have a nice day. Thank you.